If you've watched people play custom tracks, you may have noticed that a lot of the time, they end up going for down tricks. And obviously this isn't done just to be cool or anything. There's many reasons for this, mainly either being because it's the most consistent trick to go for, or it's actually the ideal trick to get out of the 4 you can do. The factors that influence this decision I'll be explaining throughout this video. Before I start, this strategy is used for flip trick ramps. The things I'm going to discuss don't really apply to ones that don't do a flip, and that's because these 2 types of ramps do different flipping animations, so yeah, because of this, I'll be using examples from flip trick ramps. The most common reason people will go for these down tricks is to get good landings from jumps. In Mario Kart Wii, it's possible to bounce back into the air once you land onto the ground. Generally speaking, you want to be in the air for as little time as possible because airtime tends to be slower. With this bad landing here, if you look at the speedometer, I gradually lose more speed until I land back onto the ground, where I can accelerate once again. In the case of tricks, what can happen is that when you bounce, not only do you lose more speed from that extra airtime, but if you look, I'm going at around 86 kilometers per hour instead of 120. That's because I got back into the air before getting the full speed from a trick boost. When I remove this bounce, as you can see, I gained quite a bit over the ghost that bounced. So how do you prevent this from happening? Well, the most common reason why this occurs is because you either land on your front tire or land on both of them. Because you don't want to be in the air a lot of the time, what people do is they pull down to reduce it. As a consequence though, if you hold down the entire time, this means that depending on how high the ramp is and what trick you do, you'll find yourself a lot of the time landing on your front tire because tilting downward causes your vehicle to do so. Thus, more bad landings occur. Holding neutral in the air also makes your vehicle stay neutral once the animation wears off, and as I said earlier, this also causes bad landings sometimes. As to why this occurs sometimes, it's just what happens, really. Nintendo coded the game's physics to give you seemingly random actions based on things like how fast you were going, and where exactly you are positioned to the track itself, so sometimes these bounces just occur. There are ways to minimize bounces with nosedive landings, such as pulling back just before you land. This tends to decrease those chances, and as I'll be explaining, doing one of the 4 tricks may decrease those chances. However, when you land on only the back tire, this bouncing doesn't happen nearly as often. If in that example from earlier, I decided to pull back before I land on the ground and landed firmly on my back tire, if I pull back enough, I will get a good landing here 100% of the time. For some reason, when you land on the back tire here, as well as land on your back tire in general, you don't end up getting a bounce. I can't explain exactly what in the game's coding causes this, other than just saying it's basically human RNG. But yeah, pulling back stops bad landings. There are a few things to note with this strategy, however. For starters, because you're pulling back in the air before you land, this means you're increasing your airtime. Thus, a lot of the time, you'll end up landing later onto the ground, slowing you down depending on things like the height of the ramp itself and how long you lean back. For example, with the BKT on Glimmer Express trains, Sawyer pulls back before landing from this trick. When I edit his run to make this a nosedive, I ended up saving time because I landed sooner than him, albeit not that much. However, pulling back like Sawyer did ends up being overall better because, well, 1, you're not increasing your airtime that much, and this obviously minimizes the risk of getting a bad landing, and 2, by not bouncing, I get to maximum trick speed a lot sooner than a bounce. I've also seen it where sometimes leaning back doesn't really lose anything. Like when I changed Sawyer's landing here to a nosedive, I actually end up on the ground on the same frame where he pulled back, and then I bounce and lose more time. Yeah, like I said, it depends on various factors, so experiment with whatever ramp and see what happens. For the most part though, pulling back slows you down. In addition, each trick animation does different things and has different hit boxes, so when a flip is still occurring, you're bound to the physics of said trick. If you notice with an up trick, towards the end of the animation, when I'm pulling down, I'm facing downward, thus landing on my front tire. This also means more of a risk of getting a bad landing. However, with a down trick, towards the end of the animation, it'll instead be the back tire that'll be facing towards the ground, even while pulling down in the air to reduce airtime. Thus, if by the end of the animation you're close to the ground with your back tire facing towards it, you can prevent bad landings very easily. As a result of this, what people end up doing is right before they land on the ground, they either hold neutral in the air or pull back to keep the vehicle facing this way. And while this can ever so slightly increase airtime, it's so minimal to the point where people would rather play it safe to prevent the inconsistent time loss from nosedive landings. So the combination of good landings occurring with landing on the back tire as well as a down trick setting you up perfectly for one is why so many custom track players use down tricks. And just to show how particular these landings are, let's look what can happen if I do an up trick off this ramp on Aquadrome stage. So when you look, it appears I stayed on the ground, like I didn't get this lethal bounce that the other bad examples got. However, if you look very carefully at the speedometer here, I got stuck at 98 kilometers per hour for a few frames. So even if it appears I was on the ground the entire time, I actually wasn't. And just for comparison, once I changed this to a down trick, I avoided the bad landing and ended up saving time. The other main reason is that when you land on the back tire from a down trick in a certain way, you can find yourself turning very sharply as soon as you touch the ground. For example, here on Nightlife Party, when I do an up trick here, I don't go in super tight on this turn. In fact, I exit it pretty wide. However, if you land on your back tire and you were at a point in the animation where the front tire almost touches the ground, you'll end up going in way tighter. Another good example here is at the ending of Skyline Avenue. Runs here do a down trick off this ramp because it allows them to take this right angle turn significantly tighter. And just for comparison, let's take Spear here. Spear has the widest drift of any inside drifting bike in the game. When I do an up trick here, I go so wide that I end up hitting the wall ahead. But when I change this to a down trick, I evade the wall hit entirely. And one last thing with this strategy, I said that you need to be in a state where your front tire is almost touching the ground. To accomplish this, what people end up doing is they pull down in the air just enough before a turn to make this happen. When I don't do this and pull back, for example, I end up going way wider and fall off. So yeah, that happens just because landing really far back on the back tire sends you really freaking wide. Lesson here, don't pull back that much. Now that I've explained a lot of things with down tricks, I want to add a few more things just so you're aware of them. If you're in the air for long enough, which trick you do doesn't really matter. At least when attempting to land on the ground. Like here on Mushroom Peaks, I'm in the air for so long that with every trick, the entire animation finishes well before I get back onto the ground. There are some minor differences that can happen depending on the trick you do, such as turning sideways with a side trick causing weird things to happen with its momentum, but at least in terms of landing on the ground, it's your choice if you want to risk the nosedive or not. There are two more things I want to mention. I've said so far that bad landings are generally not good to get because they slow you down. However, there is a niche property with them, and that's when you get to bounce with a nosedive landing, you'll turn in the air significantly better once you bounce. And the bigger you bounce, the more you turn. So for example, on Coin Heaven, the BKT does a down trick here because it's the most consistent way to get a bad landing. This allows Brody here to turn in much more tightly for this shroomless cut. And lastly, side tricks can send you in tightly sometimes. If on Nightlife Party I do one, try for some sort of nosedive, and then turn in the direction of where the back tire lands, you'll end up turning in very sharply like a down trick. Meanwhile, turning in the direction the front tire lands sends you wider. That being said, down tricks are generally more consistent than side tricks are, so people stick with down. As to why you see this mainly on custom tracks and not so much Nintendo tracks, well, the records on Nintendo tracks are a lot more optimized than CTs. At this point, records can't really afford to go for the safer back tire landings. Every millisecond matters, and runs are going for things that save like 0.005 at this point. So yeah, runs generally risk the nosedive. There are some instances where the down trick strategy is used. For example, on Coconut Mall, Breakson does a down trick off this ramp, and Demon, yes that is him, does one on this ramp on Maple Treeway. And yeah, ideally, you would want to risk a nosedive, like changing the trick here on Coconut Mall to an up trick with one saves some time. However, both of these tracks have a lot of inconsistent things you have to go for that can cost way more time. These escalators here can end up chucking you really high into the air, and all this airtime really slows you down. Or in the case of Maple Treeway, the entire track. I basically consider this a CT with how dysfunctional it is. Point is, in these cases, it just ends up being more worthwhile to take a very minuscule time loss with these tricks, just so you have a higher chance of finishing a run. And that wraps it up for this video. As you can see, what trick you do can have a big influence in Mario Kart Wii. They're not just for show. Each trick you can do has its own special set of properties, with the main feature in this video being a down trick. If you enjoyed what you saw here today, please subscribe to this channel and give the video a like. It was very fun explaining this strategy as so many custom tracks use it in time trials and online. Thank you all for watching and have a lovely day.